us as learners, right, we never want to have an aha, I got you moment, right? But knowing, like, it's okay to keep photosynthesis up on the board, and this is the equation for it. Or if you want to put a reminder at the bottom of your classwork saying the equation for photosynthesis is cellular respiration is active transport is, right? And so you're kind of differentiating, right? And so you have your really high scholars, then you have your lower scholars, right? And so our higher scholars, we're like, okay, they may not need this as much as our lower scholars, but it's still like a little reminder to tell them. But then it's all gone when it's time to take that formative assessment to see, hey, we've given them the reminders, we stamped it, right? And we've addressed the misconception. So now they should be able to perform.
And then the last thing, I noticed that there's a test question that's focused.
The open-ended one? It's the open-ended response.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you which open-ended response was most challenging.
I chose this one because I thought it was interesting too that there's a lab about dialysis tubing that we were going to do, and it's directly related to this question.
And and the fusion and moving across the cell membrane. And so what was most challenging about that when looking at it, or what misconceptions did you identify that students would have when doing the dialysis tubing and referring to osmosis and diffusion?
First of all, being able to identify which molecule is moving across the membrane, what semi-permeable means.
Yes.
And then why is this molecule moving but not this one? And how can we tell why they've moved? And then also you not only have to identify what the relationship is, why it's moving, but can you explain the process too?
And so conceptually, and think about the criteria for success for this question in particular. And so the key components students need for this question would be what?
What is tonicity? Like, what is the process of diffusion? Why can certain molecules move across semi-permeable membranes?
That's what you have so far? Okay, that's fine. So thinking about this question, right? Yeah. And thinking about the lab. So basically meshing those two together. And so even like to push your thinking, when we say what is tonicity, so what do we specifically want students to be, what do we want to be stamped about that, right? What are the most important, highest leverage thinking thoughts for students to be able to identify what that is? And then also to taking that still for everything else that's tied into it. So even we're talking about diffusion, but we still want students to know what active transport is and what thinking steps they need to have in order to identify that. Passive transport, what thinking steps they need to identify that to reach mastery. the process of osmosis and diffusion, right? Because if we're able to have the thinking steps for all of those components that's needed to answer this question to mastery, then students can say, this component has this component has this. I definitely know this is diffusion because this is what is actively happening, right? And so just, it's kind of like taking it bit by bit, breaking it down, so it becomes full circle. And those are just the little, it seems like a lot, but it's just like the example of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And so some of us, we put the jelly on both breads, we put peanut butter on one, and some of us may add bananas, right? So it's the thinking steps you want students to have while thinking about that process or trying to identify what that process is. And it's just everything that goes under it. So we have diffusion. Then we have points 1 through 4 and what it means and what it looks like. And so it's just breaking it down into smaller portions, bite size. And those bite-sized pieces come from when it's the intro to the lab, right? And then we're completing the lab. And then we're writing our lab. We're doing our lab write-up, right? Or even physically doing the lab. Or reverse, doing a virtual lab and then physically actually doing a lab too. Because they have that hands-on experience actually feeling the material. Understanding what are you going to use iodine and sugar water? So using the iodine versus the sugar water, and then the components and the solution that you're combining, and is it soluble and things like that. And so even the smallest thing like mixing sugar and water and what happens. And so those are the thinking steps that we have to break down for students in order for them to get to that mastery, and that's when we slow down to speed it back up. You got any other questions about the open-ended responses?
I noticed that body systems and like circulatory and respiratory systems is going to be big, so I did build in already some time in my quarterly plan to make sure I'm like taking my time and stamping these things. But I definitely want to go back and make sure I'm doing that for like diffusion and stuff that we went over already.
Because it all works together, right? The body systems is my favorite.
Yeah.
And it's my favorite because it's us. Everything else is us too. Biology is life, but just knowing like the human body system, and the kids actually being exposed, like all this stuff is happening in me right now in this moment, and like saying, okay, this is the animal cell and these are the organelles that are inside of it and their functions, but what type of cell are you, right? And then breaking it down into those different body systems. Excretory system is kind of almost the funniest one when kids dive into it and say, oh my God, this is happening and this is the process and this is what's going on. So I never want you to feel like you just have to rush through it, right? And I want to help you develop the skill to like say, hey, we're going to mix these two together, right? Because they are related. Yeah. And you want the students to be able to have those. And we always say, and we think about the procedural steps, right? Because it's quicker, it's easier. We need to do this, this, and that. But conceptually, the thinking is going to get us to the procedural. And so when you are planning it out, I want you to always think like, is this a point where I need to slow down and speed up, right? Because if we miss cellular respiration, we are going to have a hard time with the respiratory system.
Yeah.
And we are then going to have a hard time with clearly identifying if an enzyme is speeding up or slowing down a reaction, right? And so those are the points. And when you, I'm happy you shared that, because that was one question that I was looking into other than diffusion, because I'm like, okay, these are two labs that are hands-on that students can actually actively see happening. But definitely when you're doing the body systems, like, and those are labs that can say, hey, if we want to implement a mini dissection, right, we can do that based on one of those systems. Okay? Other questions before we move on?
This just came up, but it's probably for later. So,
Mm-hmm.
With the final exam that
Mm-hmm.
we're supposed to be planning, so I'm gonna just take unit 1, 2, and 3,
And yep, summarize. It's a summative assessment.
okay.
You want to get everything that they've learned from all of these units. And so now thinking about what we just discussed and like those key misconceptions and key components that students need to know in order for them to reach mastery in this unit. What lessons do you think that, which lessons can you pinpoint that will get us to make sure that we address those misconceptions and key components? What lessons, and then we'll talk about how many,
Okay.
if we need to add.
Okay, so not this next week, but the week
Mhm.
after,
Mm-hmm.
we're starting the circulatory.
Week 15.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Circulatory, respiratory, gas exchange, and that can be a good place to bring back in and tie back in making sure that I stamp osmosis,
Mm-hmm.
diffusion,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what gas exchange is.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably what, that's a total of 4 lessons?
That's 3 lessons,
Okay.
because Veterans Day.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first body system.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I did an osmosis lesson last week,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm still having people asking me what osmosis is.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed that we're going to talk about body osmosis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that can be another place to bring in what is osmosis in relation to the cells in our body,
Mm-hmm.
and then and then bring in the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're talking about body systems now. So
Mm-hmm.
we talked about it in the cellular level, but now we're talking about it in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And like the whole unit is about homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I think this is a great, so thinking about homeostasis and knowing the weather is changing,
Mhm.
right? And then them actually
Yeah.
saying, hey, this is happening to my body now, I think is great. But when and I'm excited about that, because that's when they're so intrigued by this thing happening. But when you think about osmosis, and if you go back to the data that you have from the lesson you implemented last week, what I want you to think about is, like, when students are asking what is osmosis, go back to the work and see where the gap is, right? So, and we can set this up so we can look at it together if you want more support with that. So if they're asking what is osmosis, they can tell you like the overall picture of osmosis, but what gap do they have that's kind of like, oh, is this really what osmosis is? So identifying that singular gap, or if it's 2, like where can I go back to stamp that piece, right? And not doing an entire reteach for osmosis, and having them stamp that piece, and is that piece related to cellular osmosis? Okay. Was that clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so that will be 1 lesson or 2.
That's one.
One, okay. And then, so now going into, because you have your calendar up, so when you're looking at it, are there any unusual days that we need to take into account for the module or the unit?
No, besides Veterans Day.
Okay, which is a 1 day off.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Well, also Thanksgiving.
yeah,
Right, but that's, like, I plan past that.
yeah,
so-
plan past that. Okay, so when you think about the unit and the dates towards the end,
Mhm.
have you already thought about those research days?
I've put in 3,
Mm-hmm.
like, right before the exam.
Okay, tell me those days.
December 9th,
Mhm.
10th, and 11th.
Okay. Okay. Do you feel like you need more?
Yes, but this is where it gets
Tricky.
because the IA2
Mm-hmm. It's
Happens
December the
16th,
16th.
and then right after that it's the final exam.
Okay. But your final exams, December 16th is that Monday,
Mm-hmm.
and then final exams is the 17th through the 20th.
Yep.
And then the week prior to that is the week of the 9th and the 10th and 11th.
Mm-hmm. And the 12th and 13th is the exam.
Hmm. Do you think we need to go a week? Do you think it will be, how much of a disruption would it be to go a week earlier? To add one of those reteach days in a week
Yeah, so
for one of those, or not a whole reteach day, right?
Mhm.
So we have the 9th, 10th, and 11th. I think that's December what, 5th and 4th? Is that the 5th and the 6th?
Yeah.
And so having those 90-minute blocks, we don't have any days off that week,
Mm-hmm.
right? So do you think if you did a 15-minute reteach, but still 15 because it's 90-minute periods, right?
Yeah.
So if you split the time up, 45 and 45, do you think that will be enough time for you to actually complete the lesson for that day as well as implement the reteach?
Yes, because even I can use Tuesday. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday,
Mhm.
and Friday are all supposed to be like this big lab, but I
Mhm.
don't think it needs to be for like 3 days.
For the diffusion lab, which lab is it?
This is the like homeostasis of the body.
Yeah, I didn't take that long with my homeostasis lab.
Okay.
You can shorten it, but the way you can shorten it is the pre-work.
Mhm.
So the pre-reading and pre-work for students, like the specific directions for annotations and answering these specific questions, and it will be graded for accuracy.
Mhm.
And so having the students do the heavy lifting in the beginning gives you more time to actually implement those mini reteaches.
Okay.
Okay? You got that in there? Okay, cool. Thank you so much. And then we're gonna go even the objectives.
Mhm.
So making sure when you are, because your objectives are really good, but making sure when you are reteaching, thinking about the gap,
Mhm.
and then thinking about blooms, what do I want them to actually do? Are they creating? Are they identifying? Or are they defining something?
Mhm.
So just making sure you stamp those within the objectives for the lessons that you are going to do those mini reteaches for. And then even with your misconceptions, right? So like if a student is not able to